time. I do want to welcome everybody to our Knowledge Education Series event titled Disaster Recovery, Safeguarding Your Company Data. As mentioned before, the reason for these webinars is that there's a lot happening in the technology industry that can be overwhelming for those not in the technology industry to keep up on all the information and technologies available. We hope that these sessions can bring some clarity to some of the different buzzwords that are being used in the tech world now. And again, the topic today we are covering is disaster recovery. How this session will work is this is a listen-only event. If you do have questions, we encourage you to chat those in, and we'll save some time at the end to address as many as we can. Following the session, we'll introduce a future topic that we hope will be of interest and for you to join us again. And we will be sending out emails as well that will contain a short survey that we hope you'll take some time to fill out as we want to make sure that there are future sessions that will be of value to you. So again, we do hope you find this session valuable and helpful to your business. To introduce today's presenter, the presenter is Drew Embury. Drew is the Executive Vice President and Partner in P&L Technology. He helped establish the company back in 2004 and is continuing to assist in developing new technology strategies that can help local businesses. With that, I will hand things off to Drew.
Well, good. Thanks, Steve. I think we've got a really great topic here today that really we've heard a lot about over the last year or so. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to start with why this topic is gaining in relevance, why we're hearing a lot about disaster recovery and business continuity. We're going to define potential disasters. These may not be what you think, what first comes to mind when you think about the word disaster. We're going to discuss key questions to ask yourself as you plan for disasters in your business. We're going to briefly look at developing a comprehensive disaster recovery plan for your business. And we're going to look at a couple of case studies, a couple of businesses that have made some changes to their backups and disaster recoveries and the benefits they've seen from those things. So let's go ahead and move into the first topic now. So why is disaster recovery on everybody's mind? And we think there's a few reasons for this. The first one is I think just some recent events in the area have really brought a lot of awareness to this topic. Many of us know people and local businesses that have been impacted by certain events. One of the first and foremost is the Missouri River flooding of this year. We took a ton of calls in our businesses from companies that were in the flood zone that as the water started rising were really sent scrambling to try to figure out what they were going to do, how they were going to operate if they had to leave their business on short notice. Another big event for our friends in Lincoln was the fire at the Lincoln Public School Systems Administration building. This fire, I think it was the biggest insurance loss ever in Lincoln, and it completely destroyed their entire administration building, which also happened to house the data center for the entire school system. And it kind of came out afterwards that they had a fairly antiquated backup system, or they hadn't put enough time, spent enough money on their disaster recovery, and they had some systems that were down for weeks at a time. And luckily, school wasn't in session when it happened, but it was still very painful for that organization. Another reason why we think this topic is really gaining in relevance for the business community is just every year there's just an increasing reliance on technology, and we just seem to only get more reliant on it every year. More and more businesses now run almost exclusively on information workers that cannot work at all if the system is down, if their PC's down, if the server's down. And another interesting trend we've even noticed in the last couple of years is even more traditional blue-collar type jobs are increasingly being coupled with technology, which makes these workers more reliant on the IT systems. A couple of really interesting examples just from this year alone is that we recently did a consulting project for a company that repairs transmissions and rebuilds transmissions. And they've actually put a PC on the desk of each one of their transmission rebuild specialists, which has all of the diagrams and the specifications and the parts and really the how-to on how to get that transmission properly be rebuilt. So if the system is down, in their case, they're not even able to rebuild transmissions. So it's kind of an interesting example of something you wouldn't think would be levered to IT, which is now. Another interesting example of that is we've recently worked with a company in Lincoln that's a very forward-thinking company that's in the plumbing, heating, and air conditioning space. And what they've done is equipped all of their technicians with tablet PCs. So as these technicians go out into their customers' homes to repair their heating and air conditioning system, they use their tablet PCs to pull up again schematics. They add the parts and the labor and get the customer to sign off on the project and even swipe a credit card in the home, which then transmits that all back to the main site for billing, and really is cut down on a lot of manual work and been a real productivity boost for them. So that's another case of where even a more of a traditional blue-collar position has been levered to technology and really increased that business's reliance on technology, and as a result has caused them to need to think about what happens when some of these disasters do crop up. Kind of the third reason we thought is, and really this has been kind of the disaster recovery and business continuity space has been an area where a lot of businesses, especially smaller businesses, really have not given, in a lot of cases, any thought to disaster recovery, and realizing they do need to spend a bit of time planning for this. So now that we've looked a little bit on why the topic continues to gain in relevance, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, which is defining potential disasters. As I mentioned before, it's not always what you may think of what comes to mind when we talk about a disaster. So we're going to make the differentiation today, and we'll refer back to this again in subsequent slides, on two different classes of disaster. One I would refer to as a site-wide disaster, and another as an infrastructure failure or an infrastructure disaster. So a site-wide disaster, this is typically what comes to mind when we talk about a disaster or disaster recovery. So it's typically a fairly rare event. It's much, much less likely to occur than an infrastructure disaster. And this is something like a fire, a flood, a tornado, or a theft, which typically leaves the physical building or the equipment either partially destroyed or unusable as that event rolls through your physical space. I've personally worked in the last 5 years with customers just in Lincoln and Omaha that have had their facilities totally destroyed by a fire. We have had a flood where a water main break and filled up 7 feet of water in a particular business. And we've had a theft situation where a thief broke in and stole the server. Luckily, I've never personally helped a business affected by a tornado, but due to the area where we live, I'm not gonna cross my fingers. On the other hand, other than a site-wide disaster, we also have the notion of an infrastructure failure, which certainly can fall into the category of a disaster for a business if they're not properly prepared. So this is something like a server crash where a server just fails and it goes down and it's not able just to be rebooted or very easily restored. This is a much, much more likely occurrence, and it can be just as crippling for a business because the end result is critical applications and critical things that these workers need are not available, or even, heaven forbid, email. People are just so reliant on email anymore that when that critical conduit between customers and vendors and the outside world is severed, they're not able to get much done. We deal with these types of situations several times a year. Equipment is complex, servers are complex, they have a lot of moving parts, and they can and do fail, usually with no warning. So when we're talking about disaster recovery, we really need to prepare for both types of disasters, a site-wide disaster and an infrastructure disaster. And a lot of times one is overlooked at the expense of the other. So now that we've looked at the couple different classes of disasters, let's kind of move on to key questions as you ask yourself as you prepare for a business continuity plan or prepare for disaster. And we're going to introduce a couple of terms here that are going to be pretty important in order to help who's ever helping you with your technology select the right technologies and help put the right plans into place to protect your business. So we're going to spend a few minutes on these terms. The terms we're going to look at today are the recovery time objective, the recovery point objective. We're going to see how those two items relate to the budget available for the disaster recovery technologies, and we're going to look at the needs of the business to see how it relates to the previous 3 items. So let's start first off with the recovery time objective. We also may refer to this as the RTO. The recovery time objective is a measurement in the amount of time that has elapsed between a disaster event and when the IT system is back up and running. So for example, if a server crashes at 8 a.m. and it's restored by noon, that's a 4-hour recovery time or a 4-hour recovery time objective. And we'll come back to this in a little bit. The next item we're going to look at is the recovery point objective. So the recovery point objective is similar to the recovery time objective, but it's measured in the amount of data that it is acceptable for a business to lose in the event if a disaster were to occur. So for example, let's look at a scenario where a business is only backing up once a night. So at night, at the nighttime, all the employees go home, the backups run, they come in the morning, and they're done. So let's say the backup's complete at 10 p.m. and your server crashes the following day at 3 p.m. the next day. So what this would mean for the business in that type of backup situation is the businesses may lose any data that is entered into the system since the last backup. So if the backup completed at 10 p.m. the previous night, your employees came in the following day at 8 a.m. and worked until 3 p.m., they would lose all of that data entered essentially that day. So the recovery point objective is, again, the amount of data that's acceptable to lose. If you know in your business that you can only lose 2 hours of data, and that would be a recovery point objective of 2 hours or less. And again, we'll come back to this. In the case of a budget, obviously it would be great to have the RPO and the RTO, or the recovery point objective or the recovery time objective, both at 0. But as a rule, the narrower the amount of time between those two objectives and the disaster event, the more expensive and more complex the technologies that will need to be put into place. So to arrive at the budget, oftentimes we recommend looking at the needs of the business and really taking a look at how much risk can the business owner tolerate. What would the different system outage scenarios mean to the business in lost revenue, lost productivity, customer goodwill, and so forth? This question, when answered, can then be related to the budget to select the proper technologies to protect the business. So for example, we just consulted with a company that does warehousing here in Omaha. And we determined after working with the business owner that his recovery point objective needed to be 1 hour or less. So for example, if he had a server crash or an outage or any type of disaster, he really needed to be able to restore the data to as it sat to 1 hour or less, to 1 hour ago. The reason he needed this is he had pulled items off of the warehousing shelf and shipped them to customers, and there would just really be no way to recreate that data if he lost an entire day's worth of data. But as we worked with this customer, we realized his recovery time objective could be as high as an entire day. And the reason for this is he was very comfortable that as long as he knew he wouldn't lose data, he could go to some paper processes with his business, record on paper what they were pulling and shipping and things like that while that system was being restored. So after we defined for that owner the recovery point objective and the recovery time objective, then that allowed us to select the proper technologies to protect him without breaking his bank, without breaking the budget. So after answering these 4 questions, the recovery time objective, the recovery point objective, the business needs, and the budget, your IT resource, your IT people can then craft a solution of technologies that can meet your needs. So now that we've looked at the key questions, let's look at some of those technologies that are available to meet the needs. So what we've done for today is we've kind of simplified some of the technologies available down into 4 different levels of backup and recovery strategies. And we're generally kind of going to go in the order of investment required to deploy these technologies. And we're going to talk about the pros and cons of the different technologies. So the first level we're going to look at is what I would just call a solid traditional backup strategy with an off-site rotation of the media. So what this is, it's typically a tape drive or a portable disk system with backup software that runs a nightly backup of the entire server system. And typically under this scenario, an office manager or somebody is responsible for changing the tapes, changing the disks, and then taking one off-site with them. This also happens to be the most common setup that we see at this point. All this is changing because a lot of businesses are realizing they need to kind of take the backups they're doing up another notch. So what are some of the pros of the traditional nightly backup system? Well, it's easily the lowest cost system out there, which is why it was very common in the past. It's also very easy to set up and a very well-known system. Some of the cons of the traditional backup systems is it does rely on a human being to swap the tapes, to swap the drives, and ensure the backups get off-site. So if you do rely on this type of system, one of the things you should certainly check is to make sure your people are indeed taking those tapes or those disks off-site. We see it's very, very frequently not done. And a lot of times we're consulting with a prospect and their backup tapes, they pull them out every night and they set them on top of their server. So although that would provide against an infrastructure failure, it would provide absolutely no protection against a site-wide disaster, such as a fire, flood, or tornado. So if you are relying on that, again, make sure your people are getting those things off-site. Some of the other disadvantages to this type of system is it has a relatively poor recovery point objective. Generally, these types of systems backups run just once a day, so they have a recovery point objective of 24 hours or more. So this is real similar to the scenario we looked at before, where the nightly backup runs, the server crashes at 3 or 4 p.m. the following day. You're going to lose really anything you've entered into the system prior to when that last full backup was run. One of the other disadvantages of this system is a relatively poor recovery time objective. Especially in the case of tape. The tape is pretty slow to copy back off that tape. So it could take even a very skilled IT person, 18 to 24 hours in some cases to get your server completely restored. So let's now look at kind of our backup level number 2, which is what we call a remote data backup solution or an internet-based backup solution. So what this is where data is backed up automatically over the internet on a periodic basis from your site to a remote site. This can be done nightly, or it can also be done several times throughout the day. So what are some of the advantages of this type of system? Well, this removes the human element from the backup strategy as it's all automatic. It's all done over the internet. So if your office manager or who's ever responsible under scenario number 1 for changing the tapes, we're not relying on that person anymore to make sure the process works. It's also much more reliable than tape-based backup solutions. The internet technology is a lot less prone to failure. Another advantage is it can run once a day or several times throughout the day. If we do run the remote backup several times throughout the day, we can obviously lower the recovery point objective and lessen the chance that you'll lose more than a few hours worth of data. And then obviously another big advantage of this is by definition it's always off-site. So this would really protect your business well against a site-wide disaster scenario such as a fire. Some of the disadvantages to the remote data backup solution or the internet-based backup solution is the recovery time objective can still be fairly lengthy in this scenario. And if you do use an internet-based backup situation, it's a really good idea to understand how you get your data back in the event of a disaster. We have worked with a couple of prospects in the past that have been on a service like this and needed a big chunk of data, but due to the fact the provider was on the East Coast or the West Coast, they had to pull that data down over the internet, which was a very lengthy process to really get that data back. Another disadvantage to the remote data backup or the internet-based backup solution is they do generally require a monthly payment to pay your provider for off-site storage. That I have worked with a few customers that have been a little hesitant to add the monthly obligations to do that. However, as businesses are seeing they need to spend a little bit more time and investment on this area, I do see that objection really lessening in the last several years. So now that we've looked at internet-based backup strategies, let's move on to level number 3, which is a shadow server backup strategy. What this is, it's a second server that's placed alongside your production server. So your existing servers that are running your applications and all your data. This is a server that essentially shadows that server and takes a snapshot of that server as often as every 30 minutes. So this type of backup has a big benefit where because we're taking snapshots of that system every 30 minutes, the recovery point objective is very, very low. If something happens to your production server and it crashes, your data can be recovered as it sat 30 minutes ago, which can be a huge advantage. The shadow server also can introduce the notion of an image level backup. So what an image level backup is rather than just backing up your files and folders, it's taking a complete snapshot of your server, including all of its applications, operating system files, which makes it much, much easier to restore that server in the case of a full crash. Basically, your provider then, in the case of a full crash, would just come in and just lay that image right back down on the server, and you'd be up with every setting and every preference that you had configured before. Obviously, this can, with the image level backups, that can really lower the recovery time objective, since it's much easier to restore, get your server back up and running much faster. And also, because these shadow servers often have what's called virtualization capabilities, the shadow servers can take over for a failed production server on a temporary basis. So your applications, your data, and everything can be booted up on that shadow server in the case of a failure. Some of the disadvantages to level 3, the shadow server, would be, obviously they are more expensive than number 1 and number 2 that we've talked about. And they generally also have a monthly investment for offsite storage as well, because you need to pay the vendor for that offsite storage that you're using. The last item we're going to look at as far as technologies available would be what we would call fully redundant virtualized servers. So this kind of takes the shadow notion of the server to the next level, and what it is essentially a hot standby server that can take over in the event of any hardware failure with almost zero disruption to any of your users of the technology. So we often see this style of backup used by companies as they approach 80, 90, 100 employees or more, or somebody that really just can't afford to have any downtime and is willing to spend whatever it takes to achieve that. So the advantages of this system is like we talked about, it can almost completely eliminate the notion of hardware failure from taking down a business. The recovery time objective and the recovery point objective are almost zero in those cases of a full site-wide disaster. Because if one of those servers crashes, the workload just automatically flips over to the next one. Your users probably wouldn't even notice there was an issue, and then the IT people could come in and repair that outage. The virtualized server also generally employs the notion of an image level backup that we talked about previously, that keep the images of those servers for quick restore in the event of a site-wide disaster, such as a fire. The disadvantage to this system is easily it's the most expensive of the options by a factor of a large factor. If you are interested in learning more about the virtualization technologies, please feel free to refer to our virtualization webinar that's on our website that we did back in August, and it has a complete rundown of the different virtualization technologies. So now that we've looked at some of the technologies that are available, let's touch briefly on developing a comprehensive disaster recovery plan. So what this is it's a written plan that's put into action in the case of a site-wide disaster. Now we could probably do an entire webinar just on putting this plan together, so we're going to look at just a real high level of this plan today. So it's very important that to understand that disaster recovery isn't just something you purchase. It's not just the technologies we covered on the previous slide. Although the technologies are a huge part of the puzzle, you can't just deploy one of the technologies that we talked about before and forget about it. So kind of the first step we see in putting together a plan is to gather the necessary parties together. Who's ever responsible for your IT, who's ever responsible for the telephone systems, the management of the organization, and really talk about the various scenarios that could arise. So we could talk about the infrastructure disasters we covered previously. We could talk about the different site-wide disasters and really what that would need for the business and start putting a plan together to address these scenarios. So some of the items to include in the plan would be physical space. Where's your business going to operate in the event of a site-wide disaster? Can your employees just work from home, or do you need to think about lining up temporary space ahead of time? Talking about IT needs. What systems are really critical in order for the business to run as some of the less critical things are addressed? Telecommunication needs. Can you operate on cellular telephones for a few days, or would you need to put together a plan with your phone system provider to have a spare system ready to go on a short notice? And then really start putting this plan together. So this plan should contain complete contact information, including cell phone numbers, email addresses, and so for everybody involved in the plan. So all of your employees, all of your vendors, all of your software providers, landlords, all of those types of things should be documented in this plan. Because typically if you need this plan, your systems are down and it's very difficult to then go back to your email or go to that card you had on your desk that had all this information in it. So then as you put the plan together, it'll detail where employees go in the case of disaster and who's responsible for everything and the names of who's accountable. After the plan's put together, we recommend revising this plan on a regular basis, perhaps even once a year to make sure it stays relevant and continues to evolve with the business. So we've touched real briefly on developing the comprehensive disaster recovery plan. Let's take a look at a couple of businesses that have taken some time to think about their disaster recovery and what that meant. So the first business we're going to look at is a business based here in Omaha. and they were a manufacturer of home, farm, and garden equipment. Several years ago, their manufacturing facility caught fire, and it literally burned to the ground. It was a pretty big deal. It was on the news. It was a 4-alarm fire with fire departments called in from several different surrounding towns to try to put this thing out. Due to the fact they were a manufacturer, there were oxygen and acetylene tanks that were blowing up, making it very difficult for the firefighters to put the fire out safely. And at the end, there was really not a single salvageable item from this entire facility, a large facility. This company was using a remote data backup, and they were a customer of ours, and we were able to get them set up with a loaner server from our warehouse and 4 workstations the very next day with a complete copy of their backed up data because it was pulled over the internet off-site. So this was a real success story for us, but unfortunately for this company, the IT systems restoration kind of turned into a project mainly as an insurance recovery, and they did end up ceasing operations, but it was due to factors completely outside the IT realm. So another case study let's look at is another Omaha-based company that's in the fire and water restoration business. They had a situation earlier this year where their main file server crashed at 8 p.m. During the week, and there was no recoverable data. We went and tried to repair the server, but there was a significant hardware failure, and we were not able to recover any of the data off of the server. The good news for this customer is they had converted from a tape-based backup system about a year before this event happened to the shadow server. So, although it did take some time to get their server repaired, the company did not lose any data. And if you recall back to our discussions about the tape-based systems that just run once a night, if this company had not invested in the shadow server technology, they would have lost any data that had been entered in their system from 8 a.m. until 8 p.m. Really an entire day's worth of data for 40 employees. Would have been a very painful situation for them. So it was a big win that they had invested in the shadow server and really didn't lose any data. So those were a couple of case studies I wanted to look at. I see we're just reaching the limit for time that we wanted to have for this webinar, and we did want to leave some time for questions. So Steve, have any questions come in since we've been on the program?
We do have a few, and I again encourage anybody else that does have a question in the back of their minds, go ahead and type those in, and we'll get to as many as we can. The first question we have, Drew, is regarding the remote backup process. When remote backups are done, are you pulling all the information off the servers, and would that drag the system down, especially if it's being done every 2 hours or multiple times throughout the day?
Boy, that's a really good question. The newer backup technologies only pull the data that has changed. So if you think about the massive amount of data that most companies have on their servers, their employees are changing things throughout the day as they do their work, but it's maybe changing 1% of the data a day, if that, sometimes even less than that. Sometimes it's even a fraction of a percent. So the newer backup technologies only pull the changed data over the wire. So it's very, very efficient from a bandwidth perspective, and I would be surprised if most companies even know while those backups are running. That being said, we do have to make sure there's enough internet bandwidth available, to complete that transaction or to complete those backups, especially if we are running those through the day. But there's some pretty easy calculations that can be done to make sure that it doesn't impact the business in a meaningful way.
That actually kind of led into the next question was how do I know my internet can handle the pull of the remote backup? Is there anything that they should ask the internet providers, or is there a standard level that we know of that might shed some light on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really going to kind of come back to before. How much data does the business have? How quickly is that data changing? And how much internet bandwidth is available? And by looking at those three things, it's fairly simple to figure out how much bandwidth is available. Especially the people in Omaha, we're really blessed by a great internet company, Cox Communications, that offers a very attractive package as far as the amount of bandwidth you get. And Time Warner and Lincoln is kind of on the same way. And they've really, even in the last year, upped the tiers that are available, sometimes even for the same price as you may be paying now. So it does make good sense to every couple of years go back and look and make sure are you getting the level of bandwidth that you need for your organization, regardless of whether you're putting internet-based backups on there. But that being said, if you are looking at going to internet-based backup and you don't have enough bandwidth, oftentimes some more bandwidth can be purchased very cheaply, or sometimes just by renewing your contract, more bandwidth at the same price or less you're paying today.
I have time for just 2 more questions here. If the backup company happens to go out of business, what protection does the customer have, or what questions should they be sure to ask or know in the event that, God forbid, that would happen?
Sure. Well, I think your risk profile is pretty low here. Obviously, anytime you enter in any kind of relationship, you want to make sure you're doing it with a strong, reputable company. There are, in every industry, in every technology, every industry, there's certain fly-by-night companies, obviously. But, they are housing your backup data, so you really only need them if you have a disaster at the same time that company goes out of business. So 2 very unlikely events would have to occur at the same time for that to be a risk profile or a situation for your business. So I think just ask the right questions up front. Make sure you're dealing with a strong, reputable company. Keeping your eye on that relationship. Have ongoing conversations. Every 6 months to a year with them to make sure they're healthy and continuing to do well. But I don't think it should be a major issue.
Perfect. Well, the last question that we have is actually, I guess, just been answered regarding the webinar session and if it will be accessible later. And at this point, we will go ahead and wrap things up in the interest of time. I do encourage anybody, if they do have additional questions, feel free to either give Drew or myself a call or shoot us a quick email. We will be sending you this recording, or the recording of this event, and for your own reference, and do encourage you to pass it along to anybody else that you think might be able to benefit from the information. We do hope you enjoyed the session. Do look forward to having you join us for future events. Just as a FYI, the next event will be a little more technical in nature, covering the topic of desktop management. It is scheduled for December 7th at 10 o'clock in the morning. The sign-ups will actually be starting in the next week or so. We will be sending an email out to you, so we do encourage you to, at that time, go ahead and sign up if you do feel that information will be of value to you. Again, we thank you for your time. Hope you found the information valuable, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.